Ever since the early morning on November 4th, when the president claimed that the election results were rigged, without evidence, without observations or real knowledge, but just pulled that notion out of nowhere and decided that it happened, I was surprised and I felt compelled to say some words about the value of making judgment based on evidence. It felt like being pro-evidence was suddenly a partisan position. Generally, this is how people naturally think. People often adopt a worldview and then, secondly, find evidence to support that worldview. Often the worldview is associated with one social group or tribe, and the sensitivity to tribal politics is such that there is little acknowledgement of the central role evidence should play in our understanding of the world. Our beliefs should not dictate what counts as evidence. Instead of being open to learning and discovery, we attach our Google cart to our bias horse, if you follow me. Okay. So does not valuing evidence take priority over our political positions? So by using the term pro-evidence, I'm suggesting that, in principle, the value of evidence is more basic than our political commitments, especially if it is as straightforward as it is in relation to the presidential election results, and as important as it is for navigating through the pandemic. So I want to talk through evidence, bias, and conspiracy theories. And I want to focus on the presidential election as an example, even though much of it is a couple months old information, but it holds some important puzzle pieces, I think. Okay. So what do I mean by evidence? Okay. I mean empirical evidence, which is evidence based on observation. When we find ourselves taking something seriously, ask yourself, what evidence is there for my belief? Is this belief directly based on observations, or is it based in my imagination? What motivated this belief? Now, the role of evidence in our belief systems is actually more complicated, but nonetheless, that general question of how observations inform our beliefs should always be on our radar. Remember that episode of BBC Sherlock when John Watson was hiding in the cage and that giant mutant dog, the imaginary giant mutant dog, was after him, and Sherlock kept asking John over the phone, "Did you see anything? Describe what you see. Describe it. What is observed? What do you know to be true?" Now, another principle to remember is this. Just because something makes sense does not mean that it is true. That is, a belief can be quite coherent, but not supported by empirical data. Sometimes an explanation can be compelling and beautifully coherent, but not supported by evidence. So this is worth exploring. I'm going to use an example from a YouTube channel called Beba Fabula. Suppose you see that a vase is broken in your house. Now suppose that you asked your son Jimmy how the vase broke. And Jimmy says, "Oh, a cat knocked it over." Okay. Well, there is no cat here in the house. And Jimmy says, "Oh yeah, it is hiding somewhere in the house. It came from outside." "Oh, but I closed the windows and doors." And then Jimmy says, "Well, it must have come in before you closed the windows and doors." And then you realize Jimmy is allergic to cats, and you bring this up, and then Jimmy says, "Well, that's because it's a Sphinx cat, and it does not have fur." I'm like, oh, okay. Jimmy's explanation makes a lot of sense. It is very coherent and explains all the potential problems. However, the only part of the entire scenario that you are actually observing is the broken vase. That is the only thing that you have empirical evidence for. is the broken vase. You have not seen or heard a cat in the house. Nothing else is broken. Nothing else. There's no movement around. There's no paw prints anywhere. So while you have a lot of details about a cat theory, you don't have evidence to support those details. Now, Jimmy's explanations are ad hoc. An ad hoc explanation is an explanation that is given to explain disconfirming evidence with no evidence to independently support that explanation. So Jimmy's explanation that a cat came in before you closed the door is an ad hoc explanation because it explains away the disconfirming evidence that you closed the door. However, when you closed the door, you did not see any paw prints there. If, when you closed the door, you noticed paw prints, and maybe you didn't think anything of it, but you noticed paw prints, then that explanation would no longer be ad hoc, because the presence of a cat, of the paw prints, the presence of the cat in that scenario is independently verifiable. A famous example from the history of science: in the early 19th century, astronomers knew that the planet Uranus did not follow the predicted orbit by Newton's theory of gravitation and planetary movement. So in 1845, Urbain Le Verrier hypothesized that there was another planet present whose gravity was affecting Uranus's movement. He used Newton's theory of gravitation to calculate where this planet would be, and this led to the discovery of Neptune. Had Neptune not been there, then the explanation for another planet used to cover up the disconfirming data of Newton's theory would have been ad hoc. Okay, so moving on. When you accept a lot of ad hoc explanations, a theory can become complex. That is, there are a lot of things involved to explain one piece of evidence. So when comparing two theories, it is worth asking, what is the simplest explanation? That is, what explanation makes the fewest assumptions? Coming back to the broken vase, if you were to find paw prints and perhaps some other broken items in the house, and you heard some cat noises, and there would then be confirming evidence of Sphinx cat in the house. But without that other body of evidence, the only thing you have is a broken vase. And then you have to wonder, what theory makes the least number of assumptions in explaining the broken vase? If the only thing you have is a broken vase, and Jimmy's testimony, and you know that Jimmy is clumsy, and you know he's capable of lying, then the simplest explanation that makes the fewest assumptions is that Jimmy broke the vase. The way that I like to think of this sometimes is to ask myself, is the coherence of my understanding of the world balanced with the evidence, with the observations supplemented by established fact? Or is there an imbalance where I have a lot of coherence, but not enough observations to evidence to justify the theory that has so many parts in it? Okay. The conspiracy theories and claims of election fraud that Donald Trump promotes or has promoted may have a lot of coherence. I mean, people are compelled by it. They may make sense given a great number of assumptions, but not many of the parts of the stories are independently verified. So when compared to alternatives, the case of election fraud makes a lot of assumptions. It may be compelling for a number of reasons, but it doesn't fit the evidence when compared to the alternatives. Okay. Now, the presidential election, was it rigged? Was there mass fraud during the election? Where is the evidence? Is there evidence of mass election or voter fraud? Well, to be sure, there are a lot of claims, a lot of people claiming stuff, but a claim is not evidence. So following the election, There were many reports and footage online claiming fraud. However, each claim and each report, one by one, have been refuted, shown to be without evidence. There are many fact-checking websites and articles. Certainly, factcheck.org is a place to go. Snopes.com. There's an excellent article by Isaac Saul on Tangle.substack. There were many affidavits, but courts did not find those affidavits to represent persuasive empirical evidence. Upon reviewing all the evidence, all the claims, all the affidavits and arguments, there are 5 big takeaways. Okay, takeaway number 1, there is no evidence of voter fraud or even mass voter fraud. Takeaway number 2, not only is there no evidence of voter fraud, but there is evidence that voter fraud is very, very rare. The Brennan Center for Justice on their website has posted studies, court findings, and government investigations that confirm this. 3, it is virtually impossible, if not extremely implausible, to rig an election. Okay, so one article in the conversation entitled "How Hard Is It to Rig an Election" is very helpful. There is also a YouTube video by Vox with a similar title, something like "You want to rig an election? Good luck." Okay. 4, many people, including poll watchers, did not have knowledge of the voting and vote counting process, and this led to the idea of fraud seeming more plausible in people's imagination than it actually is. And it led to poll watchers misinterpreting situations. So, after investigating each claim and affidavit present, and after reviewing the evidence of each conspiracy theory, and we find there is no evidence for voter fraud or election fraud, then the question becomes, why are there so many false claims of voter fraud and election fraud? And the answer to that is priming. And priming is, for example, if a child watches a scary movie and directly after that scary movie he goes to bed and he starts to interpret noises in the house as the monster in the scary movie, okay, or even the wind or shadows cast on the wall. That's priming. If you tell someone to hunt for Easter eggs on the beach and there are no Easter eggs on the beach, that person is more likely to mistake rocks, like smooth rocks, for Easter eggs because that person is primed. Okay. So Trump supporters were primed to interpret events in terms of there being voter fraud because the president had talked about it so much. 538 did an article on priming in that case, as did USA Today. And there's some other articles on priming, if I remember correctly. Okay. But another important thing to talk about is biases. It's another factor that cannot go overlooked in perpetuating myth and falsehoods. So one cognitive bias is the illusory truth effect, which is the tendency to believe something that is repeated. So a lot of people, including the president, repeated the myth of voter fraud before and after the election. So that increased the chance of certain individuals believing that there is voter fraud. That is true. Another cognitive bias is the confirmation bias, which is the tendency to acknowledge evidence and pseudo-evidence that confirms what one already believes or even wants to believe, and dismiss and ignore disconfirming evidence. So if you believe that left-handed people are very creative, you're only going to notice the left-handed people that are creative and count that as evidence. And you may ignore or just not acknowledge left-handed people that are not creative, or right-handed people that are creative. Okay. So if people already have the idea that there is widespread voter fraud, then they are less likely to do the research to verify the facts, and that's how confirmation bias works in that case. Another bias is that people tend to gravitate towards simple solutions for complex problems. People like closure and certainty, and I'll get more into that. Many biases that we have are shaped by our membership to social groups or political tribes. In fact, we tend to justify ourselves for deciding to join certain groups, okay, to reduce cognitive dissonance. So group membership and bias go together for a number of reasons. All right. I'm going to make a point. I'm going to borrow this analogy from a book called Blind Spots from Greenwald and Banaji, okay, just to make a point. If I can see, okay, so there's two rectangles represented by the tops of these two tables, these two tabletops. Now I want you to look at the longer one, the one that's longer. Okay. Notice that the longer one is right here, and the one that's wait, I gotta stop. Is there a longer one? Is this the longer one? Can we agree this is the longer one? Or should we, or is this the longer one? Does it matter if I do? No, it doesn't. Okay. So anyway, I just went down a rabbit hole. That was a trick question. These rectangles are actually, these parallelograms are actually the exact same size. Okay. Let me demonstrate it here. I'm going to take this up, and I traced it. I actually traced it there. So, yep. So now I'm going to sorry, there we go. Whoops, this one's upside down though. See that? You see what I just did? Oh, you can't even see what I'm doing here. Okay. They are the same size. Okay. It's an optical illusion, right? All right. So what's my point? When our eyes receive the data, our retinas see the shapes as identical. However, when the sensory data goes through the visual cortex, the brain turns the 2D image into a 3D interpretation. And this gives the illusion of a different length. So it is our brains that interpret the world that makes the rectangular shapes seem to be different sizes. Our brains, when they're working properly, because 3D interpretation is hardwired in our brains. So we misperceive something because our brains are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Cognitive biases are similar. We interpret reality with bias exactly because our mental faculties are operating normally. So we cannot point the finger at someone who is displaying bias, but we should not ignore our own biases. One important way to address bias is through dialogue with others, to be exposed with other points of view, and to attend to criticism. So that is the primary way to address bias, is through dialogue. Supplementary to that, however, are other exercises. So another tool is to ask yourself, what would it take for me to change my mind, on a given issue? Because if there is no answer to that question, then there is nothing outside yourself to hold yourself accountable, right? And a third way to address your biases is to engage in empirical evidence by looking at or attending to causal relationships and consequential thinking. Okay, so when it comes to politics and religion, in particular, we have a tendency to see ourselves as having the right information and everyone else as having the misinformation. So I'm going to draw insights from a book called The Knowledge Illusion by Sloman and Fernbach, which explores the tendency for people to believe that they know more about various subjects than they actually do. So studies have shown that people have strong feelings about their political position, but those feelings do not emerge from a deep understanding of the issues. That is, their support is not in proportion to their knowledge. The tiniest bit of knowledge can make us feel like we know a lot because we don't know what we don't know. When members in our group affirm what we believe, we feel like experts. And the internet allows us to meet with like-minded people to intensify this effect. So in our minds, we characterize those we disagree with simplistically. We see them as ignorant, people who just cannot understand. Now, the authors of The Knowledge Illusion have done studies where they would ask people to rate how confident they are in their knowledge about some policy, and then, instead of having those people explain why they believe in that position, rather to explain the cause and effect consequences of that policy. And then they become more humble in their views. Thinking through real-world consequences and causal relations are very difficult, but they're still very important. Look how important it is to clarify consequences for the COVID-19 response. What are the consequences for allowing spread to occur normally? Well, it could lead to crowded hospitals and put a strain on medical care. What are the results of wearing a mask? Well, studies show that wearing a mask reduces spread. And also keep in mind with that question that the classical liberal tradition that American conservatives and liberals belong to, it is ethical to mandate rules to prevent harm to others. Okay, and that's not always acknowledged, but I'm just throwing that out there, not to bring closure on that whole conversation, but it should be a place to begin anyway. And finally, what are the consequences to following the Great Barrington Declaration that proposes shielding the vulnerable population and allowing herd immunity to naturally emerge from the younger and stronger part of the population? Possibly a third of the people are considered vulnerable. So how do you isolate them? How do they get food? And how are they supposed to go to work? You can't. There's no way to really isolate one part of the population. That's a major problem in that way of thinking. And then vulnerable people are part of the community, so they cannot realistically be shielded, and the efforts to try to do so may actually create some inequalities or some issues there, I imagine. Younger people have a lower mortality rate. A significant number still end up in the hospital, and many of them have prolonged symptoms. So a natural herd immunity does not address that. There are many who are not classified as vulnerable, but then they turn out to be vulnerable. There is an unfounded assumption that those who have acquired some immunity will keep that immunity for a long time. We don't know the whole story there. We are nowhere near close to achieving mass immunity, so achieving natural herd immunity will lead to a lot more infections. And and then finally, full-scale lockdowns and mass infections are not the only two scenarios that exist necessarily. There are precautions like social distancing and masking we can use, and so there might be other sort of median solutions there. Okay, but my main point is a lot of things when it comes to attending this pandemic makes sense, but you need to attend to the consequences, the real world consequences. And again, that's hard to do. Okay, so moving on to conspiracy theories. I want to spend some time elaborating or discussing the psychology behind conspiracy theories because they are prevalent in times of distress and they are resistant to evidence. Baseless conspiracy theories are being used to explain current events. The idea that the 2020 presidential election was rigged is a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory suggests that major events are the result of a group of people secretly planning and pulling strings from behind the scenes, as it were. Skeptic Magazine has a pamphlet you can download with a section that spells out the characteristics that indicate, or some indicators of a conspiracy theory that is false. Okay, so for instance, if the agents behind the pattern of the conspiracy would need nearly superhuman power to pull it off. Okay, or if the conspiracy is complex and its successful completion demands a large number of elements, or if the conspiracy involves a large number of people who would all need to keep silent, okay, who all need to keep secrets. And those are just three, but I think those all apply to election rigging if you understand what an arduous process that that would entail. A lot of coordination and knowledge and secrecy of a group would be needed there. Yeah. Now, some conspiracy theories turn out to be true, but a great many of them are not true. But they are compelling. Examples include that we never landed on the moon. The moon landing was a hoax. Elvis is still alive. Climate change is a hoax. The collapse of the Twin Towers and the 7 World Trade Center were the result of controlled demolition. So when I say conspiracy theory, I'm referring primarily to the second kind. Okay, the untrue, without evidence. So here are a number of features that are present with conspiracy theories. One is there is a scarcity of evidence to support a conspiracy theory. In fact, a conspiracy theory tends to explain away disconfirming evidence as part of the conspiracy. So if science disagrees, then that just means the scientists are part of the conspiracy, you see. And second, conspiracy theories involve high pattern perception, where the conspiracy theorists look for patterns or connections between events that may have nothing to do with each other, but their connection seems convincingly meaningful when you only focus on those connections. Also, conspiracy theorists display agenticity, and that is the interpretation of events as a result of someone's control. If you hear the wind in the woods, blow through some trees, and then you can convince yourself that someone's following you. It's something like that. It's agenticity. People like conspiracy theories because they simplify a complex world and they make the world more predictable. Our brains do not like complexity or ambiguity, so conspiracy theories provide a narrative that allows us to interpret our experiences in times of distress. Yeah. So conspiratorial thinking is associated with high levels of anxiety and a need for control. The psychology of conspiratorial thinking is complicated. It has nothing to do with intelligence. There is some documented association with anxiety as well as feelings of alienation. There is an excellent article from the March 2019 issue of Scientific American entitled People Drawn to Conspiracy Theories Share a Cluster of Psychological Features. Very sexy title, clearly. There is a solid YouTube video by SciShow Psych that reviews conspiracy theories. There's a lot of solid research. A British researcher named Karen Douglas is an important name there. Eric Oliver is a political scientist who wrote a book called Enchanted America, and his research suggests that there are two kinds of personality, the rationalists and the intuitionists. And rationalists like evidence, causal relationships, and arguments. Intuitionalists enjoy magical thinking. So they think in terms of symbols. They associate physical objects with meaning in events. They perceive a drama behind the scenes between good and evil. So he suggests that the real tension in this country is not between conservatives and liberals, but between rational thinkers and magical thinkers. So there are conservative and liberal rationalists who have a vision of political dialogue, and they would perhaps get along very well. So a lot of things in this country could be a tension in theory of personality types. But certainly tribal, allegiance to one's group and is also a very large puzzle piece. In any case, two very costly activities are to engage with empirical evidence in relation to causality, and the other one is interpersonal understanding, to understand another person's point of view. They're very costly and energy-intensive activities, and my sense is that democracies depend on both of those activities. But while clarifying the role of evidence is one piece of rational discourse that produces traction, another engages with narratives that shape our understanding of the world, and I think the magical thinking becomes more relevant on that side of the conversation. Right. Finally, I want to engage with this notion of agenticity, because it alone seems to play a large role in ignoring evidence. I sometimes see that prioritizing blame and judgment over real issues is present, and I see it as an aspect of agenticity. So in the movie, I'll give you an example of how I interpret a lot of what's going on. In the movie Treasure of the Sierra Madre, three men go looking for gold in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico in the mid-1920s. And as I remember the film, there is this need for these three men, Fred, Bob, and Howard, who work together to trust that each have each other's back. That they not let greed or obsession corrupt their pursuit. So they have to work together. And the three men find their gold, and as they are planning to leave, Fred Dobbs, played by Humphrey Bogart, suggests that he and Bob cut Howard out of his share. Showing integrity, Bob says to Fred, "As long as I'm here, I will not let you touch a single grain of that man's gold." And Fred responds, "I know exactly what you mean. You want to take it all for yourself." So Bob says, "No, I'm totally on the level." And Fred continues to claim that he sees right through Bob. He sees that he's been preparing to turn on him from the beginning and take all the gold for himself. And Bob resolves and says, "Okay, well, we'll leave separately. How about that?" And then Fred says, "Well, that would be fine, wouldn't it?" "What do you mean?" Okay, Bob's like, how so? What? "So you can follow me from behind, sneak up and shoot me in the back." "All right," said Bob. You go ahead then." "Oh, yeah. No, wait. Bob says, "Okay, no, right. I'll go ahead." That's what he says. "I'll go ahead then." And then Fred says, "Oh, yeah. Then you can ambush me, right? You can wait for me and ambush me that way, right?" So the point is that Fred overinterprets Bob's intentions. His fear and suspicion compels him to read Bob's intentions and overinterprets. I think that's an important aspect of agenticity. I can't prove it. I don't have research. I think, or at least it correlates with it. So Fred decided that Bob was out to get him, and so he interpreted everything Bob was doing as a plot. It seems to me that this is what is going on with the pro-Trump conspiracy theories. Instead of participating in public discourse, the focus is always on the character of others. And ultimately, the confrontation of that agency, that perceived agency of the other, it's ultimately the confrontation of the agency behind the scenes, and then everything is interpreted as part of the liberals' sinister plot. Okay, so there is no space for interpersonal knowledge. There's no space for relationship or negotiation. The essential cooperation, okay, because to have a democracy, we have to cooperate and negotiate and dialogue. The essential cooperation within the parties break down, right? So bringing it back to the real world, some examples. Think of Donald Trump's ad hominem attacks. So after Trump expressed his optimism for using therapeutic drugs to fight COVID-19, and this is back in March, NBC News' Peter Alexander asked the president what he would tell Americans watching him right now who are scared. And Trump answered, "Oh, I say that you're a terrible reporter. That's what I say." Okay. A famous example is in 2017 when asked to respond to Elizabeth Warren's claim that Trump's health plan would cause people to die. Trump responded, "Well, I think she's a hopeless case. She's full of hate and anger." Okay. Oh, yeah, and he called her Pocahontas. But instead of responding to the issues, he attacks the person's character as if to communicate that that is the real issue. That is what all the name calling is about. Low energy Jeb, Sleepy Joe, Crooked Hillary. But there's so much attention to the character, to the intention. There is no attention on the issues. And every politician uses ad hominems now again. However, Trump ignores real world issues and creates a narrative of the good guy and the bad guy. And that kind of narrative really draws people in. That's human nature. And so he casts his opponents as like evil. Rhetorical analyst Jennifer Marcea talks about Trump's ad hominems when she says demagogues use these arguments typically to appeal to stereotypes and prejudices about people, and as a distraction, diverting attention away from legitimate issues. Trump also makes strawman arguments depicting his political opponents as a threatening caricature, suggesting Hillary Clinton wanted to abolish the Second Amendment, or tweeting that Joe Biden wants to defund the police, or conflating Democrats with socialists and confusing Antifa with terrorism. Okay. I think I made my point there. Okay, it's a different type of thinking. It's painting a picture of the human agency, and it triggers our sense of suspicion towards others. Yeah, it's the best I can put it right now. So there's this episode of Malcolm in the Middle where Malcolm's dad, played by Bryan Cranston, had to coach Dewey's soccer team, the Tigers. And so in order to motivate them, he explains that the other soccer teams are evil, and their next game rivals, the Blackhawks, are behind their mothers telling them they can't watch TV for no reason, their teachers giving them homework right when they are leaving school, and not getting Christmas presents. Or no, not giving the Christmas presents they wanted, but if it was up to the Blackhawks, there wouldn't even be a Christmas, right? So when it came time to play the game and everyone took their positions, once the whistle was blown to commence the game, the Tigers didn't play soccer. Instead, they attacked the Blackhawk members and started just beating them up, just pounding them. Okay, so it's a very humorous scenario, but it reveals something quite profound, because when we are in a society when we have to cooperate in order to get by, and there is a civil practice of public discourse, if one team sees themselves as a side of good and their opponents as evil, once the good and evil come into play, nothing else matters. The normal rules of engagement of civil discourse are ignored. So civility is sacred. All right. That's all I got.